It's difficult, of course, to follow people who've got brains the size of planets, like gas giants, I suppose. I wondered what planet I might see myself as, but I thought that wouldn't be appropriate. I see myself more like a meteorite. I sort of fly in, most of my ideas are destroyed in the atmosphere, and if I do land near you, you wish I hadn't. So I'm going to talk briefly about where we are with BJS and our direction of travel and some of the things that, on a very personal point of view, I see as good, bad or ugly. Well, people have been writing, if that's the right phrase, about illness and disease for about 4,000 years, and it starts off with the Sumerians, those people in what we now would call southern Iraq, by the way, not Iraq, who inscribed stuff on stone tablets. You could hardly call it a journal, I suppose. It's not particularly portable, and I imagine it was a bit difficult to get through the post in those days in southern Iraq. And you kind of wonder what happened if the chiseler made a mistake on the bottom line and included a knot or something. It's a bit difficult to go right back to the start. But still, they tried. They did have some good ideas. I actually believe that the Sumerians probably are the first people to emigrate to Australia because almost all of their recipes said that the cure would be beer. And they seem to catch on down there. Surgeons probably trace their history of writing back about 2,000 years, and maybe the origins of surgical writing begin with the Ayurvedic Sanskrit publication that's usually attributed to Sushruta. In truth, it's probably a collection of authors. It's kind of edited edition that took many hundreds of years to write. But the surgical journal, as you heard from Sam Alberti, really began not with the advent of the printing press. Nothing happened really for a couple of hundred years. It was very expensive to produce stuff, and anyway, nobody could read, so there was no need for it. So it's really a Victorian invention, and everything we believe to be good or bad in the world of publication only has a history of about 100 years. And the BJS is not in the first wave, but let's say in the second wave, in the early part of the 20th century. And I show you the front page to show you how dreadfully insular it was. Yes, it contains an editorial group that comes from far-flung places, but every one of the people on the list is British in origin, and of course it merely represents Britain and its then empire, and any notion that it might involve people from other countries, and particularly that dreadful place called Europe, which was different, was out of the question. It was a British journal for British surgeons. Most of it, because it began around about the wartime, was mainly to do with trauma. It was about visits to other hospitals by this group of surgeons and the lessons that they learned. Well, 100 years on, of course, it's something quite different. BJS, not British Journal of Surgery anymore, is, of course, a brand name for a journal that a lot of people refer to as the Blue Journal. It involves collaborations and, one might say, investment or takeover of other organizations, and represents to some extent the evolution of surgical publishing across Europe in the last 20 years. As Jeff implied, it has a kind of style, and there are things that you expect to see in BJS, and by and large we think that it's fairly high quality. We have an excellent publisher, and it comes in glorious Technicolor and is right up there, we think, in terms of quality with anything else, and that's it. But is it all rosy? Are there things that the surgical community and BJS does well that we should be proud of? How much of it is bad and how much of it is downright ugly. So what I'm going to try and do is just focus on 4 sort of broad areas and try and give you some ideas about what we as an editorial group feel are things that we do well and things that perhaps give us cause for concern. Let's begin with these issues and talk about the peer review process. What do we actually do? Well, we get somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 articles now each year, and about 20% of them we set fire to almost immediately. We share them between 2 editors and decide that this particular topic has nothing to do with surgery, therefore you've sent it to the wrong journal entirely, or it's an area of surgery in which we don't publish articles anymore. For instance, we don't publish case reports. At the end of the day, we send these out for this process called peer review, where we believe we know who the experts are, and the editors select those experts as reviewers, and on the strength of their perceived performance or previous performance, we eventually reach a stage at which we accept your masterpiece grudgingly, and we have 1 or 2 articles left over at the end of each month that we discuss between ourselves and decide grudgingly to reject it. And that's how it goes. And it turns out that at the moment we're just below about 18%, so you have some idea of just how vicious, nasty, and unpleasant we really are. But is this process really a good process as it stands? Well, some people would say that perhaps its value is over-exaggerated by the publishing community and by the academic community and those of us who are involved deeply in surgical publication. There's certainly a high risk of bias. The selection of the reviewers occasionally is made, as we do, using a combination of those that you're allowed to suggest yourself. We give you the option actually to even tell us about people you don't want to review your work, and then those chosen by the editors. Just in passing, I might tell you that for those of you who think that by asking one of your best friends to review your work, that it's likely that they will write something favorable about you, if you'd like to see me afterwards, I will tell you who your real friends are, and I would give you the names of those who have stabbed you quite severely, often on a number of occasions. So they've obviously told you they've given you a good review once before, you were dumb enough to believe them, asked them to do it again, and you've been stabbed twice. But it has been said to be elitist. It has been said, of course, that reviewers will be favorable to articles that tend to reinforce their prejudices, their views, that cite their work and make them sound pretty good. So it is a system that's not without its flaws. And just in case you wonder about it, we do, for those of you who do review for BJS, we do give you a score. And we score you from 0 to 5. 0 means you just didn't bother to write back. Thankfully, not many of you in this room, otherwise you wouldn't be here, we wouldn't have invited you, if you were what we would call grade 1 reviewers. I've put down there the kind of characteristics of the grade 1 reviewer. Now, I know what you really want to know is, what do you have to do to score a 5? And a 5, you have to write something like this, as I've tried to put this text down here. And many of you think, as you read through this, yes, I do that. Yes, I do that. Yes, I do that. And the truth of it is, we don't give out many 5s, because we're not nice people. We're journal editors. We're used to rejection. We're used to saying no, and we don't give out a lot of 5s. In this room, I'll tell you, I had a sneaky look. There's a lot of people between 3 and 4. But actually, I think that peer review is a useful process, and I think it is as good as things might be. There are other models, and perhaps these other models may achieve more prominence and more widespread acceptance as we move more fully to an era of electronic publication. And I've just put some of the things down here that other journals, not so much in the surgical and clinical medicine sphere, but perhaps in the social sciences and in the more pure sciences, have tried to do in the past. For instance, when an article is submitted, putting it on a website with its date at that time, and then asking people, the readership, the general audience, to make comment and review it that way, rather than having a selection of reviews. You can have reviews and commentary, you might say, made afterwards, which in turn, in an electronic era, could of course lead to a publication being amended and changed after its first publication date. So these are going to be quite different things. But at the moment, I'd say that the way we do it is as good as it probably can be achieved for surgical topics at the moment. The second area I want to just dwell on for a few minutes is actually the quality of surgical research. I wish that I'd thought of saying this. It was written a few years ago. It was written by the editor of JAMA, and I think it expresses a fairly true sentiment. Almost anything, almost any kind of rubbish can be published somewhere, and nowadays, well, if you're prepared to pay for it, you can get it into some open access dodgy something or other somewhere on this planet or on maybe another planet. It is the case, I think. Well, you all know that we are now in an era of evidence-based medicine, and this is the standard type of grading system that's widely used to tell us how good evidence is. But I would put it to you that it's regularly abused, and I've put in red writing there some of the statements that the surgical community just seem not to like and therefore very conveniently slip through. In other words, we believe in the value of systematic reviews, but if it doesn't suit our purposes to look carefully at homogeneity of these studies, somehow we seem to occasionally ignore it. Surgical randomized trials are another area where I'm afraid I'm going to say that the surgical community has not done well. So I'm going to say that it's bad. Why is it bad? Well, we don't do many large multi-center trials. Surgeons like to say how difficult it is to do this. They like to say how difficult it is to do this across countries and across different cultures and between the developed world and the underdeveloped world. And yet, there are plenty examples of trials where people have overcome these suggested barriers, but we've not done it all that well. The second thing I think where we do badly is this, what I call the dodgy endpoint. Instead of having the real endpoint, what we actually do is we say, I wonder how many patients I can get into this trial before everybody loses enthusiasm and can't be bothered anymore to recruit the patients. And I think I can probably get about 150. So now I need to invent an endpoint that will give me an answer when we've got to about 150 patients. And so we pick in laparoscopic surgery things like length of stay, where the result is obvious. Often, we choose not to bother with, one might say, the scientific basis on which a clinical study might be run. I think that's particularly the case when commercial companies are involved with the sponsorship of some surgical trials. Not good. And of course, I think surgeons occasionally paid a degree of lip service to some of the fundamental characteristics of randomized trials on the basis that it couldn't be done. For instance, you can't be blinded to doing two different operations. No, I dare say you can't if you know exactly what you've done. So why don't you have the result assessed by somebody else? Oh, really? I don't like the sound of that. Surgical RCTs, I say, tend to be somewhat inadequate. Here you see BJS, and here you see the world's #1 impact factor journal, Annals of Surgery. And the average number of patients that are in the published surgical randomized trials last year, 168 for us, and a measly 100 for the Annals of Surgery. And some of you will have noticed that one of these purports to be a good published surgical randomized trial involving 14 patients. Do me a favor. It's bad. We just have to accept it's bad. We need to do better. I mentioned about the poor evidence base for some things. Here is something I just pulled this the other day to try and find something contemporary to illustrate the point. A randomized trial of one of these so-called fancy biological meshes compared to an ordinary bit of doormat to repair your inguinal hernia. 84 versus 88 patients. And here you have something, it's published, it's out there, it will be quoted, people believe and will try and tell you that this is reliable. Okay, the results are published at 3 months. Who cares? Who cares? I mean, what really matters is, you know, after a couple of years, have you got a hernia back or have you not got a hernia back? That's what matters. What's tragic about this is that there is no evidence to tell us how biological meshes actually work. We still don't really know how these things function. Do they work by the incorporation of your new collagen into this biological mesh? Or is it that in some way all the collagen that's in the mesh somehow gets reorganized? What is it about the inflammatory cells that get in there? All of this is essentially unknown, but it hasn't stopped industry from pushing the surgical profession to undertaking trials on something where the evidence base is so truly appalling. There's only one word for this: it's bad. We shouldn't do it, and we certainly shouldn't see stuff like this being published and being given credence within the surgical literature. Here's another example of what I call the bad randomized trial and the bad control arm. Here's something that people have been doing for the last 10 years, trying to repair large hernial defects where most of your stomach ends up in your chest cavity. And when people first started doing this, it was done by enthusiasts who were good at it and who were determined to try and get it technically correct. And if you looked after a couple of years at the patients, about 10% of patients they got a poor result and the hernia was back again. Of course, you now come along to people doing randomized trials, and the people who are doing a randomized trial want to do it with mesh. They want the new mesh to work. And so the surgeon does a randomized trial in which he's good, or perhaps adequate, or competent at doing this mesh operation, and he makes a complete horlicks of the other operation on the other side without the mesh, and he gets a recurrence rate that's 3 times higher than people did beforehand. It doesn't seem very fair to me. It doesn't seem like this was done in any kind of objective way, and I dare say the only word I can use there again is bad. BJS tries hard not to publish this type of bad. The other area, though, in terms of quality that quietly drives some of us ballistic has been the emergence of the so-called high-quality best bit of evidence known as systematic review and its statistical compatriot, the meta-analysis. 13 years ago, BJS contained 3 systematic reviews in the entire year. Last year, we published 30, including 16 meta-analyses. And the editor of JAMA, I'm sure if he could have rewritten that little statement that he made, would have said, there is no topic so inane or pathetic that somebody will not attempt to carry out a systematic review on it, no matter how ridiculous this might seem. The problem is people believe that simply by doing a kind of endless analysis of something that this gives it some sort of legitimacy. And people muddle randomized trials with non-randomized studies into the same kind of analysis, or attempt to. They fail to realize that apples, oranges, lemons, limes might all go under the heading of fruit, but even to the average person and even to Geordies, they are somewhat different, and that's how it is. And there are other issues and failure to follow guidelines. So you end up with this kind of thing, which is in my own area of interest, and how useful is neoadjuvant chemotherapy along with surgery versus surgery alone for esophageal cancer. And many people will just look at the very bottom diamond at the bottom of the screen there, and they ignore everything else, and they'll go around and tell the world that there's a systematic review and a meta-analysis that proves that this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and you should not be offering people surgery alone. They very conveniently omit to look at those lines that keep crossing both sides. They very conveniently choose to ignore the fact that there are different tumor types. And actually, the clue to it all is in the small print, where it says words like heterogeneity, and you get something, a little statistic of chi-squared and degrees of freedom. And for those surgeons who, like me, like shortcuts, it might not be entirely legitimate, and I do hope that Muir now doesn't sort of shoot me from a distance. But when the chi-squared number is a lot bigger than the degrees of freedom number, it means you can basically forget it. So it's just not true, and we don't do that well as a community. I'm going to finish by saying about a few of the things that bedevil, I believe, all publishing. Surgical publishing is no different, and to which BJS is a subject as any other journal. Fabrication and falsification of data, thankfully, are not particularly prevalent so far as we know within the surgical community. At least if they are, we haven't caught the surgeons very often. I wish I could say the same about the other items here of author misconduct, because despite elaborate software to look into this, the crimes seem to be as prevalent as they ever were. In case you want to know about absolute straight fraud, the winner of this particular horse race is a Japanese anesthetist. Actually, he stands almost with twice as many fraudulent articles as the second person, who is also an anesthetist. A German anesthetist, I'm afraid to say. Dr. Fujii claimed to have done a series of randomized controlled trials to look at how often you could limit postoperative nausea and vomiting using a combination of SSIs and steroids. By the end of last year, he had 172 retracted articles, which is pretty impressive. And I don't think anybody's actually making book on this and betting, but I do believe that some people are sort of saying, I wonder how many above 200 he'll actually get to at the end of the day. It was actually discovered by a British anaesthetist in Torbay, John Carlisle, who noticed that all of the normal populations in every study were completely normal, and the the data were always normally distributed, and it turns out that the chances of that being the case in, I think, the first 100 and something articles was 1 in many millions, as you can see. We hope it doesn't happen. Plagiarism, copying in old money, is something that we don't like to see. And unfortunately, I think that within the community of surgeons, many people perhaps do not always understand exactly what's involved in plagiarism. The direct quotation of other people's work without attribution, without putting speech marks around it and saying that that's what a certain person said. But I think the real problem nowadays is the ability, of course, to cut and paste from published work, which can be done very quickly, and with the aid of a very cheap thesaurus, simply the substitution of 1 or 2 synonyms for other words. There are plenty of other things that are covered by plagiarism. Sad to say, it's not a rare phenomenon, and despite the new softwares and devices like Turnitin and Crosscheck that help us to try and uncover this, and we do this routinely now, still things get through the net. This was a thing that we received quite recently, an attempt at redundant publication. This is one of the other things that we really, I think, have to accept is bad practice. It's ugly, it's unpleasant, and yet it still goes on. As you read this 2 articles, you'll see that they both actually say the same thing. One of them tells you the result, and the other one just tells you what the experiment is that was going to produce this result. Not surprisingly, most of this was duplicated, and of course we were obliged to liaise with the authors and their institution in order to find out exactly why they thought they could do this. Here's another one, again, this year. This involves somebody trying to do this 3 times. This came from Japan. We're not quite sure whether or not our gift of a large sword and a small sword was taken up by the miscreants. But anyway, this was, again, you know, it's fairly obvious. You can see the titles are very similar. The work is almost identical. And it's particularly disturbing, I think, when we see multiple author publications doing this, to believe that all of these authors had no idea about what they were doing, and that what they were doing was actually not acceptable. And that takes me nicely just to sort of get towards the end here and talk about authorship, a thorny topic, one that really there's no correct answer, I suppose, about. But these are the recommendations made by the Committee on Publication Ethics about who should be an author. And it's not that you can choose paragraph 1, paragraph 2, or paragraph 3. The truth is, you are meant to comply with all 3 paragraphs in order to justify your position as an author. And of course, this is very difficult in this era. Just earlier, I spoke about the need for randomized trials to be bigger and to involve more people. And this gives us something of a dilemma. And here is the world's leading impact factor clinical medicine journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and I just took 2 consecutive articles from earlier this year. To me, the top one is ugly. You got this big long list of people here, Uncle Tom Cobley and all, and I have no idea who did what. I'm not sure I really want to finish in 27th position on this list. What contribution did that person really make? In the same issue, we have a slightly snappier thing. Maybe it's because the first article originates in North America, and maybe it's because the article at the bottom of the page originates in Britain. Maybe that's why there's a difference. Maybe we're less obsessed by it. I don't know. I kind of get worried, though, by this. I think it doesn't attribute work correctly. There is no easy answer to it. I think it's ugly. I don't like it. But beyond that, I don't have an easy answer. Journals have style. You heard Jeff say earlier that perhaps in the new electronic era, we'll be allowed to be a little bit more expansive in our language. I'm not too sure exactly how expansive you mean us to be, Jeff. I sort of see myself beginning my next article in a kind of Dickensian sort of mode, or maybe like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, you know, I take up my pen to write in this year of our Lord 2014 on the subject of. See, I still think editors will not like that. I'm sorry. But what is it about BJS and our style? Well, we don't like triumphalism. Nearly always it's wrong anyway. If you go back far enough, you'll find that somebody else actually said it long before you. And it's created many of the myths and legends about surgery. So this actually here is really for those of you who ever think that in future you have a cat and hell's chance of getting something into BJS, here's some tips about what not to put in. We don't like first-person style. We're not a we did this, we did that. I'm sorry, that's not BJS style. We don't like the use of the wrong word in English. This occurred in 20 cases. Cases are things you put your clothes in when you're going on your holidays. Yeah? This occurred in 20 patients. That's what they are. That's the name of the thing you operate on. You didn't operate on a case, you operate on a patient. Neologisms, this trendy speech, most of which, unfortunately, did come across the Atlantic. These words, you see, seem to sound better in a certain kind of accent. I'm empowered to do this. I'll empower you, all right. Somebody tell me what that word really means. We have a disconnect. A disconnect? What in the dickens? I mean, we have a connection, so we might have a disconnect. I don't know. So all these odd neologisms, and they've crept into our literature, and they're kind of unpleasant and they're bad. No scientific writing needs to include a ballpark figure, a win-win situation, and all this trendy manager speak. Forget it. If we find it, it's a kiss of death, because we look for it. We want to find out, who is this character? What has he done? That's how we are. Nasty, devious, awkward people. Redundant words. You see, what you see in speech and what you write are two different things. Past medical history, oh, that's interesting. If it's history, you know, I imagine it was in the past. You know, don't tell me about your future plans. See, if it's a plan, I imagine it's in the future. You don't have to write all this. I have to save space. Words cost money, even electronically. Somebody recently sent us a paper about surgery in austere environments. I wondered, what in the hell is this about? You know, is this operating when you're on the top of Everest? Or is it, you know, an operation done in a tent in Antarctica or something? No, it was actually just about military surgery. But let's not just call it military surgery. Let's use some fancy neologism, an odd phrase, austere environments. Well, this is what your journal looks like now. Now we understand we have to be in an electronic era and we must move forward in an electronic era. This is what we looked like a few days ago before our new web page appeared. As Jeff would point out to you, we could show this to a lot of people and blank it out and people wouldn't really know that it's the opening page of a website for a surgical journal. But no doubt in time, people will be able to recognize there'll be some characteristics of the opening electronic page that will tell people, oh yes, this is obviously something of scientific importance. But as you've already heard, the future is digital, and the future of BJS lives not in a paper journal, lovely though it might be. The future lies in smartphones and iPads, or whatever they evolve into over the next 10 years. And we understand that. And we understand that you will pull this onto your newsstand like here, and you will make use of all of those things that people earlier this morning have told you about, with all of the added features that you just can't get in a paper journal. So you want to send us one CT picture of the liver metastasis in the liver as an example, and I will write back to you and say, we just want to see the whole CT scan. The ultrasound scan, I don't want one picture, I want the video. The operation, I want the video. I want the tweet at the front of it, so you tell me everything about it. That's the nature of BJS in the future. That's what we have to become. We have to embrace social networking. For Luddites like me, it's difficult. I know that I am bad in terms of my familiarity with this. Some people would say my knowledge is downright ugly, and it's certainly not good. But I do have some idea that it does have an enormous impact, and already in some areas we see that, as I've illustrated here. So what will BJS look like as time goes by? It will be electronic. We will see it, I suspect, more as a portal in which you obtain information for access. I think peer review will change because of our ability to use these new media. I don't think that we'll be as possessed of impact factor, a rather Stone Age metric in the future. And of course, as was implied to you, we may have a completely different set of funding models through which to work as publication becomes electronic. So that's what BJS, I hope, will look like. I hope that it will still be here in another 100 years. I hope that people will be able to sit in somewhere and say that it's still good. I hope they don't say that it's bad. I particularly hope they don't say that the old editors were downright ugly. Thank you very much indeed.